March 30th, 1981 began as a relatively ordinary day for the new American president. Ronald Reagan, just 69 days into his first term, was exuding his characteristic optimism. He had delivered a speech to AFL-CIO leaders at the Washington Hilton Hotel. As he exited the hotel, smiling and waving to the crowd, a series of shots rang out. The sunny afternoon was shattered by the terrifying sound of gunfire. Chaos erupted as security agents scrambled to protect the president and apprehend the assailant. The nation, and indeed the world, would soon learn the grave news. President Reagan had been shot. John Hinckley Jr., a troubled young man with an obsession, was quickly identified as the shooter. His bullet struck not only the president but also Press Secretary James Brady, Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy, and police officer Thomas Delahanty. Reagan, initially unaware he had been hit, was rushed to George Washington University Hospital. It was there that the severity of his wound, a collapsed lung and significant internal bleeding, became fully apparent. For several critical hours the nation waited, anxious for updates on the president's condition. The stability of the American government seemed to hang precariously in the balance. Vice President George H.W. Bush was on a flight to Texas at the time. He was quickly informed and rerouted back to Washington, D.C. The now famous phrase, "I am in control here," uttered by Secretary of State Alexander Haig, underscored the potential for confusion and power struggles in such a crisis. Had Ronald Reagan succumbed to his injuries, George Herbert Walker Bush would have ascended to the presidency. Bush was a man of considerable experience, a stark contrast in some ways to Reagan's Hollywood background and firm ideological convictions. He had served as a U.S. representative, ambassador to the United Nations, chairman of the Republican National Committee, chief of the U.S. Liaison Office in China, and director of Central Intelligence. This extensive resume prepared him thoroughly for the complexities of the Oval Office. Bush's approach to leadership was often described as more pragmatic and less ideological than Reagan's. While both were Republicans, Bush hailed from a more moderate, traditional wing of the party. He was known for his cautious demeanor, his emphasis on prudence, and his belief in established institutions. Unlike Reagan, who often painted the world in bold strokes of good versus evil, Bush was more inclined to see shades of gray. In terms of Cold War policies, Bush, while a staunch anti-communist, might have initially adopted a less confrontational public posture than Reagan. Reagan's rhetoric, famously describing the Soviet Union as an evil empire, was a deliberate strategy to apply moral pressure. Bush, with his extensive diplomatic background, might have favored a more measured and behind-the-scenes approach. The transition to a Bush presidency in 1981 would have been a moment of profound national grief and uncertainty. Bush, with his calm and experienced demeanor, would have been well suited to provide that. A George H.W. Bush presidency, beginning in the spring of 1981, would likely have signaled an immediate, if subtle, recalibration of America's Cold War strategy. While Bush was undeniably a product of the Cold War establishment and deeply suspicious of Soviet intentions, his methods would have differed from Reagan's. Bush was a firm believer in alliances and multilateral diplomacy. He would have likely invested more heavily in consulting with NATO allies and seeking a unified Western stance. Reagan's early Cold War rhetoric was deliberately sharp and challenging. Bush, while sharing the goal of containing Soviet influence, might have opted for a less overtly confrontational public tone. His experience as Director of Central Intelligence gave him a deep understanding of Soviet capabilities and vulnerabilities. The massive military buildup initiated under Reagan would likely have continued under Bush, as it enjoyed broad bipartisan support. However, Bush might have been more receptive to arms control negotiations earlier in his presidency. His focus would be on verifiable agreements that enhance stability, rather than on achieving outright military superiority as an end in itself. Bush's understanding of global interconnectedness, particularly his experience with China, might have led to a more complex approach to the Soviet Union. The relationship between the American president and Mikhail Gorbachev proved to be a critical factor in the peaceful end of the Cold War. Had Bush been president from 1981, his initial interactions would have been with Gorbachev's predecessors, Leonid Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov, and Konstantin Chernenko. These were aging, hardline Soviet leaders. Bush, with his cautious nature, would likely have approached them with a mixture of firmness and a willingness to engage. When Mikhail Gorbachev eventually came to power in March 1985, a Bush presidency would have encountered him with a different set of established presidential dynamics. Bush by then would have been in office for 4 years. Known for his personal diplomacy and his ability to build relationships, Bush might have recognized the potential for change in Gorbachev sooner than some hardliners. His deep intelligence background would have helped him analyze the shifts occurring within the Soviet Union with a discerning eye. Section 5. The Voodoo Economics Question. Bush's Economic Skepticism. One of the most significant divergences from a Reagan presidency would have occurred in the realm of economic policy. During the 1980 Republican primaries, George H.W. Bush famously derided Ronald Reagan's supply-side economic proposals as voodoo economics. This skepticism stemmed from Bush's more traditional Republican fiscal conservatism, which viewed large tax cuts without corresponding spending cuts as a recipe for massive budget deficits. Had he become president in 1981, it is highly unlikely that the full Reaganomics package, particularly the extent of the tax cuts, would have been implemented in its original, bold form. Bush, while supportive of tax relief and measures to stimulate economic growth, would have approached fiscal policy with far greater caution. He was more attuned to warnings from mainstream economists about the potential inflationary impact of large, unfunded tax cuts and the dangers of ballooning national debt. His administration would likely have sought a more balanced approach, perhaps smaller, more targeted tax reductions, coupled with a more serious effort to control government spending across the board. Section 6. Charting a different economic course, tax and regulation. Under Bush, tax policy would have diverged from Reagan's path. Reagan's 1981 Economic Recovery Tax Act brought substantial tax cuts. Bush would have likely advocated for more modest proposals. His voodoo economics label suggests careful tax reductions. Tax cuts might have been smaller, phased in slowly, or targeted towards middle and lower incomes. Deregulation would have been more measured under Bush. Reagan pursued deregulation with ideological fervor. Bush, an institutionalist, would have emphasized cost-benefit analysis. The pace and scope of deregulation would have been more cautious. Bush might have balanced economic growth with environmental protection. Section 7. The National Debt. A different trajectory. The trajectory of the national debt during the 1980s was a significant consequence of Reagan's economic policies. The combination of large tax cuts, increased defense spending, and a reluctance to cut popular domestic programs led to a dramatic tripling of the national debt during Reagan's 2 terms. George H.W. Bush, with his ingrained fiscal conservatism and stated concerns about voodoo economics, would almost certainly have steered the nation's finances down a different path had he assumed the presidency in 1981. His primary economic concern would likely have been controlling the burgeoning deficits that Reagan's policies produced. A Bush administration, from its outset, would have placed a higher priority on fiscal balance. This means that the significant tax cuts of 1981 would likely have been smaller, or accompanied by more substantial and immediate spending cuts. Bush, unlike Reagan, might have been more willing to consider tax increases if deficits began to spiral out of control. The composition of government spending might also have differed. Section 8. Reshaping Global Alliances and Rivalries. An early George H.W. Bush presidency, commencing in 1981, would have subtly reshaped America's engagement with its global allies and rivals. Bush was a consummate diplomat, deeply versed in the nuances of international relations from his time at the UN and as envoy to China. He placed a high value on alliances, particularly NATO, and would have likely engaged in more consistent and deeper consultation with European partners. While Reagan also valued these alliances, his administration sometimes projected a more unilateral approach, particularly in its early assertive stance against the Soviet Union. Bush would have favored a more collaborative, consensus-building style. In relations with the Soviet Union, as discussed, the tone would have been less overtly confrontational initially, though the underlying policy of containment would remain firm. Bush's deep intelligence background would have informed a strategy based on a realistic assessment of Soviet strengths and weaknesses. He might have been more inclined to explore avenues for arms control and dialogue earlier, seeking to manage the superpower rivalry with a steady, experienced hand. Section 9. A changed domestic landscape and lasting legacies. The domestic landscape of the United States in the 1980s and beyond would have been markedly different had George H.W. Bush become president in 1981 instead of Ronald Reagan. The absence of the full force of Reaganomics would have had profound implications. With more moderate tax policies and potentially less aggressive deregulation, the distribution of wealth might not have skewed as sharply towards the highest earners. The social safety net, while still subject to reforms, might have faced less severe cuts, leading to different outcomes for social welfare programs and poverty rates. The ethos of government itself would have been less overtly anti-government. The judiciary, a key area of Reagan's lasting impact, would also have evolved differently. While Bush was a Republican and would have appointed conservative judges, his selections might have been, on average, less ideologically driven than Reagan's. He might have favored more traditional conservative jurists over those strictly adhering to specific judicial philosophies like originalism. This could have led to a Supreme Court and federal judiciary with a slightly different ideological balance, impacting landmark decisions for decades to come on a range of social and economic issues.